Well, children, where there is so much racket there must be something out of kilter. I thinks that's what twixt the Negroes of the South and the women at the North, all talking about rights. The white men will be in a fix pretty soon. But what's all this here talking about? That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted into ditches and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. Ain't I a woman? Look at me. Look at my arm. I have ploughed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could heed me. Ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man, when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. Ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children, and seen most all sold off to slavery. And when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. Ain't I a woman? Then they talk about this thing in the head. What's this they call it? That's it, honey. What's that got to do with women's rights or Negroes' rights? If my cup won't hold but a pint, and yours holds a quart, wouldn't you be mean not to let me have my little half measure full? Then that little man in black there, he says women can't have as much rights as men, 'cause Christ wasn't a woman. Where did your Christ come from? Where did your Christ come from? From God and a woman. Man had nothing to do with him. If the first woman God ever made was strong enough to turn the world upside down all alone, these women, together, ought to be able to turn it back and get it right side up again. And now they is asking to do it. The men better let them. Obliged to you for hearing me. And now, old Sojourner ain't got nothing more to say.
What does intersectionality mean to you?
To me, intersectionality means a lot of things. It means a conscious awareness of multiple systems of oppression. So an awareness of sexism, homophobia, transphobia, like patriarchy, but also like classism and also issues of race. And understanding that issues of race, gender, sexuality, disability, etc., that they're all connected to each other and that they all depend upon each other to exist. You can't have racism without sexism, you can't have sexism without classism, that they all need each other in order to exist and oppress people. And to take one of them down, you have to take all of them down. So that's what intersectionality means to me.
Explain the issue of intersectionality.
Well, I can explain it with an example. If you just look at President Obama's State of the Union address, there's a great example there. In one sentence, he talks about the economic marginality of men of color and the need to have programs at the foundation level to address them. And in the next paragraph, he talks about the economic marginality of women. But if you were to really ask, well, where do women of color show up? Women of color make, African-American women of color make 66 cents for a dollar that a white man makes, Latinas 56 cents. You didn't hear that when he talked about women, and you didn't hear it when he talked about men of color. You would know African-American women, their median net worth is $100. That means that they experience all sorts of risks that actually lead to violence, and their ability to handle violence when it happens is compromised. So intersectionality draws attention to the fact that women of color are caught between race, gender, class, and most of the time the ways in which they're vulnerable is not discussed.
And then you ask me, you know, whether I approve of violence. I mean, that just doesn't make any sense at all. Whether I approve of guns. I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama. Some very, very good friends of mine were killed by bombs that were planted by racists. I remember from the time I was very small, I remember the sounds of bombs exploding across the street, our house shaking. I remember my father having to have guns at his disposal at all times because of the fact that at any moment we might expect to be attacked. The man who was at that time in complete control of the city government, his name was Bull Connor, would often get on the radio and make statements like, niggers have moved into a white neighborhood, we better expect some bloodshed tonight. And sure enough, there would be bloodshed. After the 4 young girls who lived, one of them lived next door to me. I was very good friends with the sister of another one. My sister was very good friends with all 3 of them. My mother taught one of them in her class. My mother, in fact, when the bombing occurred, one of the mothers of one of the young girls called my mother and said, can you take me down to the church to pick up Carol? We heard about the bombing and I don't have my car. And they went down, and what did they find? They found limbs and heads strewn all over the place. And then after that, in my neighborhood, all of the men organized themselves into an armed patrol. They had to take their guns and patrol our community every night because they did not want that to happen again. I mean, that's why when someone asks me about violence, I just find it incredible. Because what it means is that the person who's asking that question has absolutely no idea what black people have gone through, what black people have experienced in this country since the time the first black person was kidnapped from the shores of Africa.
In this period, the pain to remain the same outweighed the pain to change. I see that the time period brought on an evolution, and it's contagious like hot coals. One ignites the next, and the next, and the next, and the next. When you get tired enough is when you begin to want to sacrifice everything inside of you. The fear just leaves. This is what happened in this time period.
So I'm gonna have to say, for me, being like a black queer person is always this like really huge contradiction that I've just had to work through my whole life. Because not only me, but I feel like our society, our culture, is taught that gay or queer is white, and that if you're not white, you can't be queer. Like, that's just not gonna happen. And especially for me as a black person, I've kind of argued and theorized that everyone's kind of out to get the black community, especially when you think about how you have different racial tensions in the black community. You have Latino tension with black communities, you have Asian tensions with black communities, and then you look at the fact that like poor whites have tensions with black communities, and then you have the queer community, which has tension with the black community, and that black people are just seen as competitors for resources and competition, and instead of working together with black people, instead they're the ones taking away all the resources from other marginalized and oppressed peoples. And so as a black person, I feel like if you are any kind of intersectional black identity, it's going to be a conflict, because black is just seen as this really undesirable, unwanted trait. And so being black and queer together, both very marginalized identities for me, but the ways they work are just so differently. And so for me, being a black queer person, I just feel like I'm always in conflict, and that I'm either not being black enough or not being queer enough, because these two identities demand very different things because of the ways in which we come to understand them and their purposes. So for me, I think that's like one of the biggest things is being black and queer at the same time.
And how have you seen intersectionality active in your everyday life?
Just having it kind of dictate who I am and who my friends are, and just kind of be the reality of my experiences and the people I know's their experiences, and just being a really true and valid perspective that I feel like isn't really valued in a lot of other places, and that's why I feel like an approach to intersectionality is really important, because it gives a lot of voices to those who have been historically and systematically ignored and erased. And I just find it helping me define who I am and navigate my way through the world. Being a queer woman that also deals with like disability justice, which is like my kind of thing, it conflates in a lot of really interesting ways, which is why it's really important to ballot this approach to help everyone that I feel like is dealing with struggles.
I realized that I was poor for a really long time because I'm Muslim, so we grew up with a really large Muslim community, but here in Silicon Valley, like with a lot of people who live in Silicon Valley, a lot of people are engineers or techies, and so most of my friends were really obviously well supported their entire lives. Like their fathers and moms were like scientists and engineers and all that. So I kind of grew up with that, and like when you're a kid, you look at what you're surrounded with, you're like, yeah, like that's me too, like that's all of us, we're this all together. And it wasn't until, like there were little things in my childhood that I noticed, obviously. Like I would always get like hand-me-downs from like my family friends. Or like one time our car stopped working and someone gave us a car. So like things like that, like obviously these are people who loved us and like wanted us to do well, and like that was part of like our religious community. But it was always like a weird dynamic for me, especially when you're getting older, because you're like, I don't want to feel indebted to these people, you know? And I think that's more an American thing, but I remember it hitting me like in high school, because I was seeing like how everybody like knew what they were doing for college, and knew like the resources it would take to get there and the path they wanted. Even if they didn't necessarily know their major, they knew how to do that. And I had no idea, right? I had no clue besides what I was seeing around me. And so it really affected me. I basically, I started like skipping school a lot. I stopped going. I dropped out of a lot of programs I was doing, like journalism and tennis. And it really began to like affect my mental health. I started withdrawing a lot, and like I was basically really depressed for a while, because I saw like all the subtleties of what it meant to be someone who's like a mixed race, like a woman of color, and to be poor. And I just felt like I was constantly like on the defense, right? Like even in the classroom, like I would hear things about Islam, and like it's really shitty, especially to be with other kids of color, and to have to be that one that's like, no, like this or that, you know, no, like this is not wrong, like stop fucking dehumanizing me, right? And it's like, after a while, it gets really difficult to like keep swallowing the bullshit, you know, and to like, it hit me like a ton of bricks. Like I have to do this. I have to get through academia like this, and I have to be surrounded by this fucking like these white teachers a lot of time who don't see me as for who I am, right? And so like it really fucked with me for a long time, and I saw like how my wealthier friends like could ease through it, right? Because they got tutoring and they got like, they knew how to fucking take the SATs, and they could be driven to places, right? And like and I was like, fuck, like how am I supposed to do this? And like I kind of resented my mom, because she'd always be like, just get a degree and everything will be great. And I'm like, you don't, like I love you and you love me, but you don't understand what this means in America, right? And how much of myself I have to like break open in order to like be successful, or what that means to be successful.
So the question is, do any of the identities that you have conflict with each other? And this question bothers me. because I don't feel like by nature I'm in conflict with myself. I think that being in conflict with myself is a result of being in a relationship to a state that is in conflict with me. And that conflict that the state has with me has given me negative and perceived unfiltered responses to myself that are only convenient to uphold their system or their status quo. These responses, negative and perceived, negative because they're not in my best interest, and they're not true, perceived, right, because they're false and they don't have any actual value to my life. And so if we're looking at what would be considered a negative or perceived response about queer black women in this country, we could think of a lot of different things, but none of them, you know, are come from a grain of truth. They all necessarily come from, you know, a place that isn't defined by that necessarily group of people. And I think when we think about, do our identities conflict with one another, who benefits from asking that question? And what is the system of divide and conquer that we're continuing to participate in when we validate questions like that?
How have you dealt with being a person of color and someone from the lower middle class or lower class?
Well, growing up in Rancho Cucamonga, growing up in LA, being in an all-white neighborhood, having to deal with the kids picking on you and the pressures of trying to fit into a high school that's all controlled by stuck-up yuppies and people that just don't get it. And you know, it's pressure. It was a lot of pressure on me growing up to see that I have to really work hard as I can to take every test. If I fail, I have to go back, and why someone that is not a person of color just gets a pass. And for a person like me, I don't get no passes. I have to work very, very hard to achieve something, besides being handed something or having resources. I've never had nothing given to me. I had to work hard from a lot. I lost my mom when I was 8, and my grandmother was the person that took care of me. So I had to learn a lot. I had to get a job when I was 9 years old, mow lawns. I had to really put in work. And see a lot of my friends and people around me, they didn't have to deal with that. They just had everything given to them while I was the one that had to fend for myself. So, and I still deal with that here and there. Sometimes I have to put on a different face. I have to put on the white face to deal with the public. I can't go out and be just black. I can, but if I be too black, I'm not, they don't think I'm educated enough. So I have to use different words. I can't be as comfortable as I like. So I deal with that sometimes, and sometimes I don't like it, but I have to put on my face as half. I'm like, well, this is the white face. How you doing? This is the black. Like, yo, you know. So it's, I deal with that a lot, and I just try to find some interconnectedness. I just try to find some balance between that, coming from a lower middle class.
How have these identities worked together to shape who you are?
So for me, when we're looking at things about identity and about personal experiences, we have to realize that the identities don't shape us. It's the way that the society and the system responds to those particular identities that shapes us. The identities themselves aren't necessarily descriptive characteristics of anything. So to be black, to be a black woman, isn't descriptive. It's as is. It's the fact of nature, right? But in this society, to be a black woman means something based on what the society and structure mirrors back and says that we are, or tries to, to define us as complementary to their status quo. And I think, playing into that game of, the identities shape my life. No, the system has shaped my life, but then I had to reclaim what my life looked like outside of what the system defines. And in that process, right, you're able to see those points in your life where you stopped either trying or you were told that you didn't have the option to decide who you were. And I think that, once people realize that they have that option, things change for them.
If I could give myself advice when I was 5 about my identities, I would say, okay, so wear makeup as soon as possible, paint your nails as soon as possible, piss people off now. Like, start now. Literally, for me, I just wish I would have known. I mean, I always knew that, like, there was something different about me. I just never had the terms. I didn't have the terms like genderqueer or queer to really, like, understand who I was. I would have just gave myself a vocabulary book and been like, read this. How do you feel? And just had a conversation with myself about literally why coming out now. I would have sort of came out sooner. I would have honestly came out sooner, and I know that as a matter of fact. Like, there's no doubt in my mind. I would have sat down with myself, and I would have been able to be like, this is what I am, this is who I am. Because society, our culture, like the institution, like whatever, wasn't able to like tell me who I was as a person, inform me of my identities, and give me an outlet to express myself. I was just always so in the dark and didn't understand who I was as a person. So it was always really hard to be like, what am I? Who am I? There is nothing out here that like really fits who I am or can describe what I am. And so if I would have just had all these terms and just this knowledge, I would have just instilled all this knowledge in myself. And then I feel like I would have become more confident sooner and less insecure sooner. I feel a lot more secure in myself now, and I feel like if I would have known those things, I would be a lot more secure. I had a lot of insecurities when I was younger, like a lot. And I just feel like that's what I would have told myself, was just like, here's the terminology, you do exist actually, and just giving myself like validation and visibility for once as a young person, because I didn't have that until I was probably like in middle school or high school.
Being queer has no bearing on race, my white publicist said. True love is unaffected by color. I curb the flashes of me crashing across the table, knock his blonde skin from Manhattan to Montego Bay to bear witness to the bloody beatings of brown boys accused of the homosexual crime of buggery. Amidst the newfangled fads and fallacies, the new age claims that racial and sexual freedom has finally come for all. These underinformed, self-congratulating, pseudo-intellectual utterances reflect how apolitical the left has become. It is now commonplace to hear young activists of all races say, I can't explain why, but the term lesbian just comes across as confrontational to me. Why can't you people just say you date people? Tongue and courage tied with fear, I am at once livid, ashamed, and paralyzed by the neoconservatism breathing malicious amongst us. Gay, lesbian, bisexual, ally, feminist, artist, two-spirit, non-gender conforming. Every year someone comes up with a new term for us. Yet every day I become more and more afraid to say black or lesbian or immigrant. Every day, under the pretense of unity, I swallow something I should have said about the epidemic of AIDS in Africa, or the violence against teenage girls in East New York, or the mortality rate of young boys on the south side of Chicago. Even in friendly conversation, I have to rein in the bell hooksian urge to kill motherfuckers who say stupid shit to me. All day, bitter branches of things I cannot say out loud sprout deviant from my neck. Fuck you, you fucking racist, sexist turd. Fuck you for crying about homophobia while you exploit the desperation of undocumented immigrants to clean your hallways, bathe your children, cook your dinner for less than you and I spend on our tax-deductible lunches. I want to scream out loud. All oppression is connected, you dick. At the heart of every radical action in history stood the dykes who were feminists, the anti-racists who were gay rights activists, the men who believed giving women the vote could only make our communities stronger. As the violence against the poor increases, where are the human rights campaigns in those neighborhoods where the atrocities occur most frequently? As the tide of the Supreme Court changes, where are the marches to support a woman's right to an abortion? And what are we doing about health insurance for those of us who cannot afford it? HIV/AIDS was once a reason for gay white men to act up. Now your indifference spells the death of Latino women and imprisoned black boys. Apparently, if the tragedy does not immediately impact you, you don't give a fuck. A revolution once pregnant with expectation flounders, apathetic and individualistic. No one knows what to call leading anymore. The faces that now represent us have begun to look like the ones who used to burn crosses and beat bulldaggers with loaded guns. The very progressive politicians still dance around the issue of gay parenting, and the term marriage is still reserved for those unions sanctioned by a church-controlled state. For all the landmarks we celebrate, we are still hyphenated Americans and niggers and bitches and aliens and minstrel references for jokes created on the funny pages of a white heterosexual world. The current leftist manifesto is a corporate agenda, and outside of that agenda, a young boy dressed in drag is sucking someone else's dick to pay for his dinner. A woman is beaten every 12 seconds. Every 2 minutes, a girl is raped somewhere in America. And while we stand here well-dressed and rejoicing, in India, in China, in South America, a small child cuts the cloth to construct you a new shoe, a slave trade of shoes and shirts for impoverished lives. It's time we put our bodies where our mouths have always been. As feminists and free-thinking people, come one, come all those committed to radical social change. We are not simply at a political crossroads. We are buried knee-deep in a quagmire, in a battle for humanity. The powers that have always been have already come for the Jew, the communist, the trade unionists, the terrorists. The time to act is now. Now, while there are still ways that we can fight. Now, because the rights we have left are still so very few. Now, because it is the right thing to do. Now, before you open the door to find they have finally come for you.
For me, like one really big part of, I guess, how I am in the world, and part of my beliefs, like my core principles for organizing, is that I myself don't want to be taking away from the space for others, right? So it's been an ongoing challenge for me to really recognize, you know, like where I stand in terms of my own privilege as being cisgender, as being straight passing, and to an extent, like definitely class privilege, where in whatever space I am, I really want to really recognize where I can make sure the space can be open for others to really tell their stories, because I see that as really important. And it's really hard, right? Because when there are folks who understand that sometimes it's hard balancing that, where there's a need for being heard and having that shared reality, and then there's that doubt of, wait, am I really making the space unsafe for people? Am I taking up more space than I probably should? And I think addressing that in terms of looking at intersectionality, I think that's really powerful, where when we look at these things as, here, we have these differences, but the differences are not the things that divide us. And I think I roughly quote Olafur in that, but recognizing intersectionality is a way where we can start healing ourselves and each other.
I think that we are complex beings, and that no one identity or label fully encompasses everything that we are throughout the entirety of our lives. I think that we have a tendency to want to categorize things so we can make it easy for people to put you in a box and decide from that box, how am I going to treat you? Where do you fit into my life? Without me actually getting to know who you are. I think that intersectionality is a tool for us to reclaim those complexities. I think that it's an avenue for us to begin to understand the various ways our personality traits, our experiences, our interactions with the world around us actually play out, and then how those in turn inform the way that we think about ourselves.
This project represents a collaboration between students to unpack essential issues within the field of critical race and ethnic studies. In particular, this collaborative effort utilizes and incorporates a feminist perspective to outline and address the idea of intersectionality and its relevance to academics, activists, and anyone impacted by the struggle. By introducing a feminist critical race and ethnic studies lens of analysis, this group attempts to remind our community, locally and transnationally, there is no such thing as a single-issue struggle because we do not live single-issue lives. A threat to justice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. All oppression is connected. Therefore, in order to dismantle and properly deconstruct these systems of oppression, scholars and organizers must come together in solidarity to create intersectional coalitions for social justice. To sustain intercommunity relations and progress, all of us must come together from all cultures and walks of life in order to liberate all people from oppression.
This involves recognizing the interdependent relationship different institutions of power and forces of oppression share. White supremacy breeds racism, xenophobia, nationalism, and other forms of oppression that remain unable to advance without the help of heteropatriarchy and capitalism. An intersectional framework and approach recognizes the linkages between all forms of oppression working together and calls forth an immediate response from us to do the same. An inter-community struggle requires inter-community effort to work towards social justice and the liberation of everyone. We cannot play favorites in this battle against oppression, nor can we hope that assimilation will by any means grant us these asks.
A complete rejection of state representation through the form of legal rights is necessary in understanding how power works to make marginalized communities compete with each other for legal rights. What's more, marginalized communities fight each other for the purpose of state recognition, resources, and rights, rather than fighting against the state, which seeks to always keep marginalized communities in conflict with each other instead of solving the real problem. Intersectionality reminds us of the importance of solidarity between all people and why we must all stand together to disrupt, dismantle, and disturb the advancements and deployments of the state. This process involves a dialogue locally and transnationally to rethink identity politics, representation, and agency through both individual and systemic forms of resistance.